Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start in exactly the place that Eddie started, with democracy. The beautiful fact that we get to determine who makes our laws, which is geographically or historically pretty unusual, right? We're very lucky to be living in a place where that's taken for granted. And in fact, one of the arguments that I'm going to be making is that taking power back from Brussels will mean restoring honor and purpose to the act of voting. I think if you ask any politician of any party, if they're being honest, what's the most common reaction you get on the doorstep? It's, oh, it doesn't make any difference. Nothing changes, right? I've stopped voting because nothing changes. I don't want to get power back from the EU and then leave it festering in Whitehall. The whole purpose of getting it back is to push it downwards and outwards to local government, or better yet, to individual citizens, to take decisions more closely to the people that they affect. The whole basis of my argument is democracy, but I am not going to be part of that democracy, because I am inviting you on the 23rd of June to fire me, to make me redundant from a very comfortable, very well-remunerated job with large tax-free expenses. Everything you've read about those Eurocrats' expenses and those MEP gourmandizing, Michelin-starred lifestyles, absolutely right. In fact, double it, right? So I would not be doing that. I would not be asking you to serve me with my P45 if I were not confident that the economy as a whole will do better outside the European Union. And therefore, incidentally, there will be plenty of openings for newly unemployed MEPs to do something more productive than legislate in Brussels. Now, why do I think that? Why do I think that we will be better off out, not just democratically, but in the literal financial sense? Well, let's take it as read that it's not because I'm against cooperating with Europe, right? I mean, like Eddie, I speak a couple of other languages. I speak French, I speak Spanish. I've lived and worked all over the continent. I've got no problem, and I don't know anyone who has a problem, with the idea of neighboring countries getting together and arbitrating their disputes peacefully and achieving collectively what they can't do singly. Okay? You'd have to be mad to be against that. If the European Union was simply an intergovernmental forum, if it was simply a club of nations working together, like the Commonwealth or the IMF or NATO or the G7 or whatever, right, we wouldn't be having this debate now. We wouldn't be having this referendum because nobody would object to it. The problem is that the European Union has become remote, self-serving, corrupt, cut off from the people it purports to speak for. And can we take one other thing for granted? We're all in favor of peace in Europe. I mean, I kind of hope that doesn't need saying. But I feel in this debate that it is just worth putting on the record out there. Nobody wants to start the First World War again. Right? But just ask yourselves one question when we look at the history of the European Union. Does it make more sense to see the EU as a cause of peace in Europe? Or doesn't it make more sense to see it as a consequence of a European peace that was based on the defeat of fascism, the spread of democracy, and to a lesser extent, the NATO alliance? Well, let me put that a different way. Look at the way in which European integration is being pursued now. The two pillars on which it rests are the euro and the Schengen zone. Jean-Claude Juncker, with that peculiar imperviousness to reality that characterizes his cast, says that they are the two greatest achievements of the European Union, the euro and the Schengen zone. It makes you wonder what the bad things are if those are the two greatest achievements. Would you say that jamming these countries together in monetary policy and in migration policy is soothing or stoking national antagonisms? Look at the way Greek newspapers write about Germany now. Look at the way German newspapers write about Greece. Would you say that forcing these countries into these large, non-democratic blocs makes them get on better or worse? Shall I tell you a funny thing? Democracy around the world tends to generate peaceful relations. When countries get to a level of advanced development, democratic norms, they stop, or they become much less likely to arbitrate their disputes by force. In my native South America, discarding one or two tiny kind of border skirmishes, there hasn't been a major interstate war since 1941, and they're outside the European Union. North America hasn't seen a conflict since 1865, and they're outside the European Union. Switzerland hasn't seen conflict since 1848 or an interstate war since 1815, and it's outside the European Union, and by the way, doing pretty well. So why do I think that Britain would be better off living under its own laws, trading and cooperating with its friends in Europe, but governing itself? Well, if I had to put it in one sentence, it would be this. The European Union is obsolete. It's a hangover from an earlier age, a relic of the 1950s, a time when freight costs were high, refrigeration was expensive, and regional blocs looked like the future. But my friends, that world has been left redundant by technological advance. In an age of the internet and cheap flights and Skype, geographical proximity has never mattered less. It's as easy for a firm here in my constituency to do business with one in Ljubljana in India as with one in Ljubljana, Slovenia. In fact, it's easier. The Indian company will be English-speaking. It will use the common law if there's a dispute between the two parties. It'll be arbitrated in a way that they both recognize. It'll have the same accountancy models, the same unwritten business etiquette. None of these things is true of the Slovene company, despite years of single market regulation. Back in 1975, during the last referendum, it looked as though Europe was the coming idea. Britain was in a bad place. We had the 3-day week and prices and incomes policies. We were the sick man of Europe. We looked across the channel. We thought, these guys are doing something right. Does anyone feel that way today? Looking across the channel and seeing the convulsions of the twin euro and migration crises. I fear I interrupt someone. No? Carry on, sir, carry on. You're the important one. It's always about the media on these occasions. So, just here's the basic statistics. The year that we joined, 1973, the EU, the 28 countries that now make up the EU, were 36% of the world economy. 1980, it was still 30%. Today, it's 17%. Actually, I say today it's 17%. 17% at the beginning of this year. It's probably less than that by now because it's tumbling virtually by the minute. Over the last 10 years, China's economy has doubled in size. India's economy has doubled in size. Ethiopia's economy has doubled in size. But the Eurozone, incredibly, is the same size now as it was in 2006. Now, I've got to tell you, my friends, this is no place for a country like ours. You know, we're a trading country, a merchant country. We don't sit on great natural resources in this green, damp, exquisite island of ours. We have to make our way in the world by what we buy and sell. That means we have to be where the customers are. And it's increasingly obvious that the customers are not going to be in Europe. The world that you guys are graduating into is not the same as the one that I or Eddie did. Europe is no longer at the center of things, except on those two-dimensional maps where it's given an artificial centrality, by the way, in which the map is drawn up. And I think that affects, bizarrely, our view of how the world is. Over the last 10 years, every continent on this planet has experienced significant economic growth, except Antarctica and Europe. Actually, I made this point the other day, and a Spanish friend sent me a furious email with reams of statistics, and I had to accept as I read down his list of figures that I got it completely wrong. He was right. It turns out Antarctica is actually doing fine. The main economic activity in Antarctica is cruise ships, and they're booming. So actually we are trapped in the world's only shrinking trade bloc. And we're paying for the privilege of belonging to a customs union that isn't growing. £19 billion gross, £11 billion net. Now, there's always a row about the numbers. Okay, the Leave side quotes the gross figure, and then the Remain side says, oh yeah, but some of that money is rebated and some of it's spent here. Absolutely true. But first of all, I think it's perfectly legitimate to quote the gross figure because that's what we normally do in politics, right? If I say to you, how much do you pay in council tax, I'm guessing you'll tell me what you actually pay. You don't say, well, I have to deduct what they take off on the value of the street lighting and the value of the bin collection. Right? If I say to you, what's basic rate income tax, would you say, well, it's 20p in the pound, or would you say, well, actually, if you think about it, it's zero, because it's all given back in roads and schools and hospitals. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to count the gross figure, rather than pretending that all the money spent by the EU is spent on things we'd have chosen for ourselves. In fact, it's very often spent on purchasing the loyalty of powerful and articulate interest groups. But even if you want to take the net figure, we're talking about what the French would call an important sum of money, Eddie. Right? And let me put it in context like this. During the last Parliament, during the coalition government, 2010 to 2015, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, across the whole of government spending, the austerity programme saved £36 billion. During that same 5-year period, our gross contribution to the EU budget was £85 billion. Our net contribution was £42 billion. So even if we insist on taking the net figure, that one clean excision would have wiped out the entire domestic cuts programme across the whole of government spending, and still have given us enough left over to take a penny off income tax. But you know what I think is higher than the straight financial cost of membership is the democratic cost. We fought a civil war in this country to establish the principle that laws should not be passed, nor taxes raised, except by our own elected representatives. And now, who is it who has a monopoly of the right to propose legislation in Brussels? 28 unelected European commissioners who are not just, actually they're not just, it's not just undemocratic, it's actually anti-democratic. We've uniquely contrived a system where you generally have to have lost an election to get appointed. So it's only when, like Chris Patten or Neil Kinnock or Peter Mandels, or indeed now Jean-Claude Juncker, who just lost the election in Luxembourg, it's only when you have been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and legislate for them. And my friends, if we were run that way, if Britain were administered by 28 unelected British commissioners, who, as a result of being invulnerable to the ballot box, immune to public opinion, had come out with such spectacular disasters as the euro, the CAP, the common fisheries policy, the overregulation of small business, the Schengen catastrophe, I'd be against that. I hope all of you would be against that. Right? It wouldn't make you anti-British. It wouldn't make you Anglo-skeptics. It would make you Democrats. One more thought. On the 23rd of June, there isn't going to be a status quo option on the ballot paper. We face a fork in the road. One path leads to a relationship with the European Union based on a common market, not a common government. Such a relationship as is enjoyed by every other geographically European state that is not an EU member. Okay? There is a pan-European free trade area that stretches from non-EU Iceland to non-EU Turkey. Throughout that zone, you will not encounter any tariffs. Right? Every non-EU country except one, Monaco, the Isle of Man, Montenegro, Macedonia, Switzerland, any of them, they all enjoy unlimited access to the EU market. The only exception is Belarus, which chose instead to form a customs union with Russia. Now, I've never heard anyone in Brussels suggest that if Britain were to leave the political structures of the EU, that we would somehow be excluding ourselves from that free trade area. Never heard anyone suggest such a preposterous idea. So that's one option. Free market, not political assimilation. But the other option is not staying where we are. The other option is acquiescing in the further political, military, fiscal integration that is coming. Now, some of you will think, okay, I'm happy to do that. I'm guessing Eddie would happily put himself in that category. He's always said he's a British European, he's happy for the European Union to become more of a political entity. Right? And if that's your view, perfectly legitimate. You can vote Remain with a very clear conscience. But don't imagine that you can somehow cast a qualified Remain vote. Right? Remain doesn't mean staying where we are. Voting to stay in doesn't mean voting to stay put. Voting to stay in means implicitly acquiescing in everything that is coming our way. The idea that I could go back as an MEP and then start objecting to things, people would just laugh, right? As I say, there is no qualified Remain vote. Every ballot to stay in will be taken in Brussels as a warm round of applause. Carry on, guys, you're doing a brilliant job. Keep at it. And that's the choice we face. Are we going to be an independent country, interested and involved with the affairs of every continent, including Europe, but ultimately living under our own laws, defending that precious democratic right that, as Eddie correctly says, previous generations have fought for? Or are we going to hand more and more power to people whom nobody elects? Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. We are just setting out, if we leave the EU, on a journey that will lead to our prosperity, our self-government, and our self-belief. Extraordinary idea that we couldn't make a success of things as an independent country. If we can't, who can? Right? We're the 5th largest economy in the world. We're the 4th largest military budget in the world. We are one of 5 permanent seat holders at the UN Security Council. We're one of the leading members of G20, G7, Commonwealth. We have unparalleled links to other English-speaking countries. We are connected by language and law, by habit and history, and by kinship and custom to every other continent and archipelago. How much bigger do we have to be before we're able to flourish under our own laws? Edmund Burke said that a nation is a partnership between the people who have died, the people who are alive, and the people who have yet to be born. I had some funny news not long ago. Shortly after polling day, my wife and I are expecting our 3rd child. This is 11 years after our last child, so this was a pleasant and unlooked for but delightful surprise. One of the many things that I want for that child is to grow up as a citizen of an independent country where we have the right to hire and fire our lawmakers. My late father, in the last analysis, was prepared to volunteer to defend that right with force of arms in 1944. I don't want his grandchildren to lose that portion of their inheritance. Eddie, I'll run through those in order because they were all very good questions. Luciano, first of all. 4 months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed in Switzerland with a face that looked like a smashed tomato, having attempted a jump on a ski slope that I shouldn't have attempted. And the Swiss are very efficient. I was incredibly well treated. I mean, you know, if you've lived there, it's by far the cleanest and best run and most efficient and happiest country in Europe, and richest, by the way, so plainly some kind of miserable life is possible outside the EU. They're also very good at claiming money. And when they came round and said, "Where's your EHIC card?" And I said, "Well, my wife's got it." And they said, "Tell her to take a photo of it and text it to you." And that was that. Now, Switzerland is not in the European Union, and that carried on. A really important point. The day we leave will look just like the day before, but that's the day that we can start to diverge. So all of the reciprocal deals on things like healthcare will be in place until one side or the other chooses not to be part of them. Now, obviously, it will be for a future British government to decide whether to remain part of the EHIC scheme. There is an argument, for what it's worth, that we are doing much less well out of it. We pay about 7 times as much to EU nationals in the UK as we benefit in exchange, but I think that most potential future governments will want to keep it. I've never heard any politician in any mainstream party saying that they wouldn't. And I think that also applies to Erasmus, which, as you know, applies to Norway, to Canada, to Israel, to all sorts of non-EU countries. It would be for us to decide whether or not to remain in it. Faye asked whether I'm in a unique position to influence things. I mean, let me give you a very recent example of this. There's a proposal going through the EU at the moment to regulate commercial ports. Okay? Now, British ports are in a very different situation from continental ports. They're private, they are small, they're thickly dotted along our coasts, and they compete with each other. Okay? There is a massively intrusive piece of regulation that would force every port to have competition, more than one internal supplier for its bunkering and its towing and so on, which might make sense in Rotterdam or Antwerp or one of these giant ports. Even there, I'm not sure what it's got to do with the EU, but everyone agrees that it's bad news for British ports. All the port owners are against it, all the trade unions are against it. Every single British MEP voted against the proposal. Every British MEP had previously voted for an amendment to exempt small privately owned ports, right? The Greens, the Labour, everyone. And yet, it went through anyway. And this leads us to the basic problem. Okay? Having a minority input in decisions in Brussels doesn't make it democratic. Democracy isn't just about a periodic right to put a cross on a ballot paper. Democracy also depends on a relationship between government and governed, a relationship between the people who pass the law and the people who are expected to obey the law. We have to feel some identity, some community of interest. Now, a few people may feel, as Eddie does, that we are European in the same sense that somebody could feel Swedish or Hungarian or Portuguese. But I don't think most people do. I certainly don't feel that I'm part of a cultural continuum that includes, Finland and Bulgaria, but that doesn't include New Zealand or Canada. And I think I'm in the majority, although we'll find out in due course whether people really do see Europe as their nationality. And that's the problem. There isn't a European demos. There isn't a European people, a unit with which we identify when we use the word we. And if you take the demos out of democracy, then you're left with the kratos, you're left with the power of a system that has to compel by force what it can't ask in the name of patriotism. And finally, very quickly, yes, of course, we're better off than we were in 1975. The countries that have done best in Europe are Norway and Switzerland that didn't join at all. The countries that are one stage down from that are the countries like Britain, Sweden, and Denmark that stayed out of the euro. The countries that are stagnating are the ones that have gone deepest into the whole thing, and especially those countries in the Mediterranean that are suffering immiseration because Eurocrats won't admit that the single currency was a mistake. So the lesson that I infer from that record is if we take back control, if we tailor our policies to suit our own needs, we will prosper, and by the way, so will all of the other countries, because they also will be freer to make their own decisions.
Thank you. Daniel.
So Alex says it's a good thing to help other countries, right? I mean, again, who's arguing against this? Who thinks it's a bad idea to be engaged positively with friends and allies on every continent? Right? As long as we're in the EU, we are paying a great deal more to wealthy French farmers than we are to poor African farmers. As long as we're in the EU, we are applying a protectionist trade barrier, not only to Africa, although Africa is worst hit by it, but to all developing countries, in a way that both impoverishes producers in those countries and impoverishes the poorest consumers in Europe, because their food prices are hiked by the common agricultural policy, and the lower your budget, the higher the percentage of it that goes on food. As long as we're in the EU, we're part of a system where these giant corporations get to set the rules in a way that suits them and hurts their rivals. It's no surprise that the people pouring money into the Remain campaign are Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Citibank and all of the people who have spent years creating a regulatory regime that raises barriers to entry and tilts the playing field against either the startup or the innovator or indeed the consumer. And now you say that it's immoral to try and replace that with a better system? No, I don't think freedom, democracy, and autonomy are immoral things. I think we have to bear in mind the distinction between the fantasy EU, the idealized EU that is all about peace and collaboration and so on, and the actual one that has taken shape under our noses, which has become a racket whereby the people lucky enough to be in the system are able to compel tribute from everybody else. As far as World War II goes, the point I was making was about the defense of democracy, the defense of our right to live under our own laws through people that we can hire and fire. And that was an international effort. It was particularly an effort where Britain was supported, as it had been in the First World War, by friends and allies from every corner of the world. There was virtually not an English-speaking country that wasn't involved in the defeat of Nazism. The numbers are awesome. 2.5 million people just from British India, the largest ever volunteer army in the history of warfare. Every single one of them a volunteer, right? There was no conscription in India, because they felt that our values were better than the enemy's, and do you know what? They were right. I am very glad that we won the Second World War, and indeed that we won the Cold War, because it means that freedom, liberal democracy, the elevation of the individual above the state, the idea that the rulers don't get to make up the rules as they go along, have now become mainstream values. And I don't think there is anything nationalistic, bigoted, xenophobic about celebrating the fact that we've created a system where power has passed from remote elites to the general population. To come back, my criticism of the EU is not that it involves working with our neighbors, right? I've lived and worked all over the continent. I speak French, I speak Spanish, I'm very happy and familiar with other places. My problem with it is that it's become an oligarchy. It's become an extractive system. It's no longer responsive to the people it's supposed to work for. And it's been captured by some very large corporations and vested interests. The third question, being compared to, would it be like Norway, would it be like Switzerland? I mean, of course, we're not going to be like any other country exactly. We're often asked this in the referendum. If we leave, what would be the deal? Would it be Iceland? Would it be Canada? Would it be Guernsey? I mean, the fact that you're asking the question in that way shows that no two other countries have identical deals with the EU. So, of course, we're not going to precisely mimic any of them. We'll have our own deal tailored to suit our own conditions and needs. The only point about Norway, Switzerland, Guernsey, and all the rest of them is that they have tariff-free access to the EU. So the one thing that they all have in common is that they are part of a free trade area, and that's the one thing I think we can take for granted. What we do beyond that, how far in, what bits we choose to keep, well, that would be for a democratic government to negotiate. But I would just make this point. There are 193 states and territories represented at the United Nations. 165 of them are not in the European Union. A lot of those countries are doing very well. Norway and Switzerland are the richest countries in the world. Norway, Switzerland, and Australia are the three countries with the happiest, they come top of the happiness metrics of the United Nations in terms of longevity, literacy, infant mortality, and so on, right? So plainly, you can flourish outside the EU, but why is it that here, uniquely, we are expected to apologize for wanting to make our own legislation? Why is it that we have to kind of prove that it's not based on bigotry or isolationism or nostalgia, right? Nowhere else do people think that you need to excuse yourself because you want to hire your own parliamentarians. New Zealand is not about to join Australia. And people don't go around saying, oh, these Australo-skeptics, when are they going to understand that they're just a small offshore island clinging to 19th century notions of sovereignty? Japan is not applying to join China, as far as I'm aware. And people don't say, oh, these bigoted Sino-skeptics, when are they going to get it through their heads that they've lost their empire? It is a natural, healthy thing for a democracy to live under its own legislation while trading and cooperating with its friends and allies on every continent. Final question from Claire about, are we too small to make? Well, I've never really got the idea that we're a small island. I mean, in what sense are we small? Global reach? Size of economy? Geography? I mean, there's how many million islands in the world? What's a bigger island? More, Sumatra? Borneo? I mean, who are the big, powerful, influential islands? We are the 5th largest economy in the world. But for what it's worth, the countries with the most successful trade policies are outside the European Union. It's the Singapores, the Chiles, the Switzerlands that have managed to sign the most extensive free trade agreements. We cannot sign free trade agreements with any other country as long as we're in the EU. Only Brussels controls the commercial policy of the 28 member states. What does that mean? It means we don't even have agreements in place with our closest friends and allies in the Commonwealth. There isn't a free trade agreement between the EU and Australia. Why? Because it's being blocked by some Italian tomato growers. Now, the Italian tomato growers may well be right. I don't know enough about the detail. But how on earth does that mean that we can't have a bilateral FTA with Australia? We thought we had a trade deal between the EU and Canada, but now even that's being blocked because of some unrelated dispute about access for Romanians wanting to get Canadian visas. Now, again, the Romanians may or may not have a decent argument, but how on earth is it to our benefit to make our trade with the growing parts of the world dependent on the agreement of 27 other countries in the one bit of the world that isn't growing. Finally, Eddie said we should stay in to make it work. Well, first of all, I'm tempted to say, well, what do you think we've been doing the last 40 years? I mean, that's our policy ever since we joined, to try and reform the thing. But if you were in any doubt about whether we could carry off a successful reform, a proper overhaul of the thing, look at the recent prime ministerial attempt at a renegotiation. Right? 2 years of arguing, crisscrossing the continent, going to every capital, and he comes back with what? Not one power back, not one penny off our contributions, not even a treaty change. And so just ask yourselves one question. Look at how intransigent the EU showed itself to be, how unable or how unwilling to reform, and ask yourselves this. If this is how we were treated now, the second largest net contributor, before we had our referendum on leaving, how would we be treated if we voted to remain? Any idea that we could stay in and then try and reform it, having thrown that card away, it would be laughed at in Brussels, and with good reason.
Thank you. There's somebody at the back that answered a little bit shorter, because we'd like to get one more round in after this. So, Daniel.
Okay, well, I'll address only the three that weren't for Eddie. On the first point, Ellie's question about immigration, I think the key thing here is control. It's democratic control. I'm actually a supporter of economic migration. I think this country benefits from the energy and enterprise of people who are prepared to leave friends and family behind and come. And those are exactly the people you want, right? And I think historically we've done very well out of it. And I think we should also, because we are, as Eddie reminds us, human, we should always make space for a component of people who are in need of sanctuary. But it's about control. If I'm going to make those arguments here in my constituency, people are prepared to accept it. All they ask in return is a sense that we are ultimately in charge of roughly who comes in and roughly in what numbers. And as long as we're in the EU, they have no such sense. And I think that there is a real unfairness here to precisely the people that Ellie was speaking about, the non-EU people who are trying to come here and who have suffered from the most extreme crackdown in the visa and migration regime because we have had to free up unlimited space for 500 million EU passport holders. Like every other elected politician, I have constituency cases every week from constituents of Commonwealth backgrounds who now find that, they can't bring relatives over for weddings. I mean, never mind to settle here, just to visit, because we have so viciously cracked down, because there's a practical upper limit to the amount of space, on people who are connected to this country in order to free up space for people who are not. I think that's immoral. I come back to the people who volunteered for us in the 2 wars when we were most in trouble. Families of those men now can't come in many cases, because they happen not to have the magic EU passport that gets you to the front of the queue. I think that's wrong in terms of ignoring who our friends are. But I also think it makes no economic sense that we are in practice turning away qualified computer engineers, doctors, and so on from Commonwealth countries in order to free up unlimited room for people who may have no qualifications but who happen to hold EU passports. Chris asked about NATO. Asked about Putin and whether I think he's a pussycat. No, I don't. I think he is a despot, an authoritarian, and a tyrant. I'm not suggesting that Britain should withdraw from the NATO alliance. I noticed, though, that there was an interesting approach to Putin taken by Jean-Claude Juncker. He said, we need a European army in order to scare Putin. He said, we won't use it, but it'll scare Putin. Now, I don't know whether Putin's a pussycat, and I'm no expert on the Russian autocrats' nightmares, but I can't imagine that he's kept awake by the prospect of Jean-Claude Juncker saying to NATO, don't worry, guys, we'll take this one from here. I think we are part of a tried transatlantic security system, and I think it is dangerous to undermine it or duplicate it with this European army. And then finally, Ben asked about the prospects for graduates. Look, I come back to making this point. You've got to think of the world that people are graduating into now, not the world that I graduated into, right? I was debating not long ago with Dennis McShane, the former Labour MP, and he said, do you know, Danny, he always calls me Danny for some reason, I don't know why, do you know, Danny, we sell more to Belgium than we do to the whole of India. And I said, Dennis, that's precisely the problem, which of those two is the better long-term prospect? We've got to think about where future growth and investment is going to be. It's not going to be in the enervated, declining, exhausted Eurozone. We need to raise our eyes to more distant horizons and rediscover our global vocation. Okay? Well, since you tee me up and invite so naturally my advert, the first thing that I can do is plug my book, Why Vote Leave, which is exactly what it says on the cover and is available for signing afterwards. I wish I had £9.3 million of taxpayers' money, as the Remain side had, in order to send you all a free copy. But sadly, I haven't, but it is for sale for £10 a copy. Look, I mean, no one is, again, does this really need saying no one is against humanity? That I'm aware. Hands up if you're against humanity. Hands up if you're against hope. Okay, so we're all on the same side, whether you Leave or Remain, okay? We're all in favor of the survival of the human species, and right? Let's take that as common ground. Why do I think that ours is the hopeful side? Well, I'll tell you what I've noticed about this campaign. The Remain guys, it's not just that they're not saying anything positive about Britain. They're not even really saying anything positive about the EU. Everything they say is about the plagues of locusts and frogs that will come the day after we vote to leave. And it becomes beyond parody. We're going to be helping ISIS, we're going to be causing World War III, and I don't know whether the fall in house prices comes before or after the war. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so I think that voting to Remain would be endorsing a campaign based on fear rather than aspiration. It would mean giving in to bullying rather than following our hearts and doing the hopeful thing. And I don't think that's the kind of people we are.